We began last week talking about Eretz Yisrael, and if you have the pages here of the Hegyonei Halacha, we pretty much got up to page 240. But with your permission, I would like to backtrack a little bit and review what we saw on pages 237 till 239, those pages. If you recall, Rav Yitzchak Mirsky, in his essay here on Kedushas Haaretz on page 237, quotes the Meir Einei Chachamim. And I want to add something that I missed last time. What I didn't do last time, I should have, was open up the Chumash itself, because the Meir Einei Chachamim bases himself on a pasuk, but Rav Mirsky only quotes part of the pasuk. And I really got stumped on this. But then I opened up inside and I said, well, too bad he didn't quote the earlier pasuk. Maybe he relied on us to look it up. So we're now in Parshas Lech Lecha, in Breshis Perek Yud Zayin, and we're looking at pasuk Ches, which again is not quoted here in the Hegyonei Halacha, but it should be. V'nasati lecha ulezaracha charecha es Eretz megurecha es kol Eretz Knan lachuzas olam. In that pasuk, Hashem is promising Avram that he, Avram, and his descendants would inherit the land of Eretz Canaan. However, if you read the next two psukim, you begin to understand that there's a flow here. There's a logical progression. Because that promise of Yerushas Haaretz depends upon the next two psukim. And this is the pasuk, this unit is the mitzvah of Milah. And I'll read to you the psukim. Vayomer Elokim el Avram, ve'ata es brisi tishmar, atov es arachach rechel dorsam, zos brisi asher tishmoru, beinu bein zarachach v'rech, himolachem kol zachar. So the chiddush here of the Meir Einei Chachamim, which we could have missed, it's a matter of, opening your eyes and seeing it in the flow of psukim, that one promise, the divine promise of inheriting the land, is contingent upon bris milah. So it's not just coincidental that the pasuk of Nasati lecha ulezaracha charecha comes immediately before the pasuk Vayomer Hashem Elokim v'atas brisi tishmar, meaning now you want to see the fulfillment of my commitment, says the Ribono Shalom, that you and your descendants would inherit the land, then you have to fulfill the bris. And the bris is Himolachem Kol Zachar. So that's point number one. Point number two, that the Meir Einei Chachamim is Machadish, is that there's a definite connection here between Eretz Yisrael and bris milah. We'll see it over and over again throughout Tanakh and in the Nuschayat Tfilos, in Birkas Hamazon. We'll see it all over the place. But the emphasis here is that these two mitzvos are very unique in the following way. They were given to Avram Avinu before Har Sinai, before the nation of Israel emerges as a separate entity. So that these elements of Eretz Yisrael and bris milah are so essential to the people of Israel that even before they emerge as a nation, an Am Skulam, Mamleches Kohanim of Naasav and Ishma and 613 mitzvahs, already they are in the parsha of Eretz Yisrael and bris milah. And both of these represent and reflect on the special relationship between Hashem and the people of Israel. And based on that, he wants to answer another question. There's a famous medrash. We spoke about this last week, but I love repeating it. It sinks in. It says that Moshe says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, why is it that I don't get to be buried? Why don't I deserve the merit of being buried in Eretz Yisrael? Yosef, his bones are carried back to Eretz Yisrael and buried there at the end of this last week's parsha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, quote, Misha hoda bi'artzo nikbar bi'artzo. Misha lo hoda bi'artzo nikbar bi'artzo. Yosef declares, Higanov guvnavti mi Eretz ha'ivrim. Meaning, my origin and my existential commitment is to Eretz ha'ivrim. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, when Bnos Yisrael say, Ish Mitri Tzilonu Miyad Haroim, he's called an Ish Mitri. And Moshe says nothing about Eretz Yisrael, nothing about being an Ivri. So therefore, he's not Choda Bi'artzo, and he therefore doesn't get to be buried Bi'artzo. We see how important it is to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, by the way. Now, the obvious question is such a fundamental difference. When Yosef is described as Re'u Hevi Lanu Ish Ivri, in other words, this man who's here in Mitzrayim comes from Ivri, from Ever Anar. It makes sense that Yosef's response would be to say, I come from Eretz Ivri. Because that's where he came from, and now he finds himself in Mitzrayim. But in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, he came from Mitzrayim. And he's going to Midian, and then he's going back to Mitzrayim. So why should he identify himself as an Ivri? Why is Moshe Rabbeinu taken to task, forfeiting, as it were, his place as a Makom Kfura in Eretz Yisrael, when the Gemara, the Medrash says we have to compare him and contrast him to Yosef? But this comparison is way off the kilter, because when it comes to Yosef, it's true. He comes from Eretz HaIvri. Now he's in Mitzrayim. But Moshe Rabbeinu had never stepped foot into Eretz HaIvri. He came from Eretz Mitzrayim.
Yosef was not born in Eretz Yisrael.
He was born in Eretz Mitzrayim. So
Yosef.
Oh, you're talking about Yosef. I thought you were talking about Moshe.
Yosef was not born in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, he may not have lived there all that long, based on how old they were when they came to Eretz Yisrael, and he was sold. He may have only been there 5-6 years.
Well, again, we're not counting years right now. What we're saying is that they were pointing their finger at this man, Yosef, and saying he's coming from Eretz Ivri. That's what they said to him. Re'u hevi lanu ish Ivri, meaning somebody from Ivrim. And Yosef identifies himself as Ganov Gunav to Eretz Ivrim. That's exactly what they said to him. He's just mimicking them and telling the truth. But you can't expect Moshe Rabbeinu to say that I come from Eretz Ivrim, because he didn't come from Eretz Ivrim. He came from Mitzrayim. And as I said before, he never stepped foot into Eretz Ivrim. So what's the bang here on the head of Moshe Rabbeinu? And this is where we mentioned the tshuva, the rugged tshuva, which is pretty much the last thing we discussed last week, that the rugged tshuva, basing himself on a Gemara Ksubis on Daf Ayin Hey, the Gemara says, darshaning a pasuk in Tilim, that even someone who wasn't born in Eretz Yisrael, the pasuk describes him as Yelidei Aretz. Yulad Ba, on page 238. What's going on over here? Says the rugged tshuva, in the case of the Turks that took over dominion over Palestine, and they said you have to take a shvua that you were born in the land of Israel, and they want to know, can they take such a shvua? Said the Rogatchover, yes, based on this Gemara in Ksubis, if you identify with the land of Israel, then it's as if you were born in the land of Israel. And the pasuk describes you as Yulad Ba. And that was the head of the great leniency of the Rogatchover. Now, if we put this all together, and we've already established that the inyan of Eretz Yisrael, I don't want to call it a mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael because we're not even up to Kabbalah Sator yet, but the inyan of living in Eretz Yisrael was given already to Avram Avinu before we emerged as a nation. And add that to the Gemara Ksubis that says that a person should identify with Eretz Yisrael, and then it's as if he was born in Eretz Yisrael. Then Moshe Rabbeinu could be taken to task because even if he didn't live in Eretz Yisrael, he should be identifying with Eretz Yisrael. And this is especially true because the identification with Eretz Yisrael is not dependent upon our people emerging as a nation. Even as a fledgling, the Avos and the Nishvatim, they also have the inyan of Eretz Yisrael. So that now, if we put this all together, we shed a new light on the Meir Einayim, right? It's a new light of the Meir Einayim, and he's right that perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu should be taken to task because the inyan of Eretz Yisrael already began with Avram Avinu way before we were Makabel 613 in Har Sinai. And the Gemara in Ksubah says that if you identify with the land, then you are a Yelid Ba. So Moshe Rabbeinu should have said, I identify with the land of Israel. I am therefore Yelid Ba. And I am from Eretz Ivrim, not an Ish Mitzri. He allowed himself to be identified as an Ish Mitzri. Had he identified enough with the land, again, this is all on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. Please don't misunderstand me. You know, we're talking about Daki Dakus, and that very sensitive level of an neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu, he should not have let it go by when they identified him as an Ish Mitzri. That's what I wanted to add to last week. I didn't have it clear.
I still, again, just to back up with Moshe, you know, he did grow up in Paro's house and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he's not getting the same kind of concept. How much does he even know?
He knows a lot. I'll tell you, he knows a lot. He is really brought up, although he's in the palace of Paro, they had a special arrangement in which he was educated. When he came out of the palace, he knew he was a Jew, and the first thing he encountered was an Ish Mitzri, Hika Ish Ivri. And this is not just coincidental, by the way, because this is Moshe Rabbeinu's first encounter with Golus Mitzrayim, and he sees an Ish Mitzri hitting an Ish Ivri. He realized that, in fact, according to one opinion, Joe, how did he kill the Ish Mitzri? With Shem HaMeforash. Rashi mentions it. You know, you're not talking about a guy who was, is untrained. And there was an arrangement in which his mother and others could come and teach him. But the bottom line is he did not identify as much as he should, again, relative to a Moshe Rabbeinu. That's on a higher level that he didn't identify with the land of Israel. Now, interesting is that Yoshua, before he crosses the Jordan, he has every Jew, guarantees that every Jew undergoes Milah. And now it makes sense, because if we're connecting the bris with HaKadosh Baruch Hu of Milah together with entering into the land, then before you enter into the land, you got to you got to fulfill that bris, the commitment of Himol Lachem Kol Zachar. That's another benefit from this whole discussion. And then on page 239, we discussed the concept of Zizus. And I told you at the end of the Shia that if you need a heter for living in Chutz La'aretz, come to me, I'll find you a heter. But that's on a rational level, looking up in Shulchan Aruch. But when you talk about Zizus and going way beyond, you see, the concept of Zizus here is a fascinating concept because it sounds like a derogatory term. It would be translated as something like impetuous, like Ruvain is rebuked in last week's parsha as pachas kamayim. That's a concept of Zizus. And he's not thinking with his head. And he makes these irrational decisions without thinking at it and weighing it rationally. But on the other hand, the flip side is that Zizus, especially when it comes to Eretz Yisrael, is a maila. It's not a negative trait, but rather a positive trait. We must suspend our rationality in order to understand why we are motivated towards or gravitationally pulled towards Eretz Yisrael. Notwithstanding Joe's comment of last week that, the borders are closed. But leaving that out, I mean, again, as I said, I think if you apply through Nefesh B'Nefesh, you might be able to enter into the land. But be that as it may, my only point is that there's something that goes above rational thinking. And just like Eretz Yisrael goes above the Taryag mitzvahs, and it's given to us before the Taryag mitzvahs, back at the time of Avraham Avinu, you see that the land of Israel is so essential to the nature of a Jew that we have something above rationale. Like, for example, we find that the Gemara at the end of Ksubis talks about all the Amoraim and what they did to get to Eretz Yisrael. And if they couldn't get a ferry over the river, they hung on to a string, and somehow they got across the water to get to Eretz Yisrael. And the pasuk says, "Ki ratzu avadecha savanel v'safar yichonanu," that your servants, God, love and cherish and desire the land. And Rav Kook is very famous for saying that when it says "Ki ratzu avadecha es avaneha," why the emphasis on avaneha? Afterwards, it says "es hafara." The answer is, says Rav Kook, a brilliant insight, that you can love the land because of afara, which means that it's mitzvahs hatliyus ba'aretz. You take the offer of Eretz Yisrael and you plant, and from that seed you grow grains, hadachayiv and trubus and maisrus, and maiser rishon, maiser sheni, maiser ani, etc., etc. But an Evan, you can't plant anything on an Evan, which means that you're not loving Eretz Yisrael because of the mitzvah hatliyus ba'aretz. There's a famous Tosfos at the end of Ksubas in the name of Reb Chaim, not Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim, one of the Baalei Tosfos, and he says that in our time we can't fulfill the mitzvahs hatliyus ba'aretz, so therefore there's no mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. So that's where Rav Kook is fighting against that shita, and he's saying forget about the mitzvah hatliyus ba'aretz. That's offer, but I have Evan. I love the avodim, the very stones of Eretz Yisrael. I desire them, and I long for them. And that craving for Eretz Yisrael goes above rationale. It's no longer the pragmatic, how do I get to the mitzvahs hatliyus ba'aretz? I want to fulfill those mitzvahs. I'm missing those mitzvahs. A whole different level. Okay. Now on page 240, which is where we stopped last week, the Hegyonei Halacha wants to connect Eretz Yisrael with Torah mitzvahs. Because if we go too far with Eretz Yisrael, we might come to the mistaken conclusion that it's an independent entity, independent of the entire structure of mitzvahs. Now, he bases his argument on the psukim at the beginning of Sefer Yoshua. Yoshua is entering the land in order to conquer it, and Hashem uses the language chazak v'amatz. Ki atah tanchil es ha'am hazeh es ha'aretz. So the initial chazak v'amatz to Yoshua is to conquer the land. And then, in the same section of Yoshua, Hashem says to Yoshua, chazak v'amatz, again, the same phrase, chazak v'amatz, lishmar es haTorah, to observe the Torah, chazak v'amatz mode, lishmar lasos kichol haTorah. And these two psukim are contiguous, but moreover, they both, not accidentally, have the same phrase of chazak v'amatz. And it's coming to teach me that the chazak v'amatz of tanchil es ha'am is the chazak v'amatz of lishmar lasos es kol haTorah. And it's all verbundet, it's all connected, inextricably connected, because you need both chazak v'amatzes, so to speak, in order to integrate them, and you have to have that strength and that dedication to both Eretz Yisrael and to Shmiras HaTorah. And you can't have one without the other. So I have a flat, an apartment on a street called Rabbi Meir. That street is also called Yoshua ben Gamal. I'm sorry. That street is also called Yoshua ben Nun. The crossover street is Yoshua ben Gamal. You know, in Israel, it's not always the case, but mostly they have the sign of the street and they explain to you the name, like who was this person. More often than not, you don't even know who they were. So under Yoshua ben Nun, it says on a street called Yoshua ben Nun, which is literally a few feet from my apartment, it says over there, Hinchil es ha'aretz. So they only have the chazak v'amatz of Keatot Hanchil es ha'aretz. They left out the chazak v'amatz of Shmiras HaTorah. Okay, that's another chazak v'amatz, but that one they left out. Anyway, so he writes here, in the name of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, that Hakavana Bazel Lishlol Das Ha'omrim Lachtol Me'esek HaTorah Shum Melchemes Haaretz. Let's forget about Esek HaTorah. Now's not the time to get involved in Torah learning. Now's the time to dedicate ourselves to conquering the land of Israel. And then the Malach shows up with a sword in his hand, and he brandishes his sword in front of Yoshua, and he tells him, you know what? You mavatal Torah. Okay, you went out to battle, but still should be. And then Yoshua does a rectification, and Vayolan Balayla hu Lon, the Gemara says, Omka Shalaloch. Says the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, don't accept a view that claims Lachtol Me'esek HaTorah. We have to forget about Esek HaTorah for the greater good and purpose of Melchemes Haaretz. No. That's not the right approach. Adarabah. HaTorah nosenes lo koach ugvura lischazik b'melchemes Hashem. Again, this is the basic argument and point of contention here in the land of Israel today, with regard to Yeshiva Bachrim who don't go to the army. And how can you not do that to secular Israelis? You know, we need gvura, we need milchama, you know, we need war, and we need soldiers. And the truth be told, even the Hezderniks are not totally dedicated to going to the army. Many of them don't go to the army, others become, you know, they join the Rabbanut and Kashrus and all this stuff. And not only that, they don't do a full service in the army, a full 3 years in the army. But the answer is this Orach Chaim HaKadosh, which we really should, put it on a banner, on a flag from Sefer Dvarim Perek Yud Aleph, that HaTorah nikres koach ugvura lischazik v'olchemes Hashem. Unbelievable. Who could believe that the greatest training for fighting our battles on the military campaign is to study Torah? That's paradoxical, but that's what he says. And David HaMelech says, "Vayitein lahem artzos goyim bavur yishmru chukov v'torosov yintzoru." You have to understand, says David HaMelech, God is going to give us the artzos hagoyim, but on one condition, that we appreciate that this gift is being given with a built-in condition. Bavur yishmru chukov torosov yintzoru. So what's the purpose of Eretz Yisrael? What's the goal? And the answer is to be shomer chukov v'torosa. Now, Rav Soloveitchik, by the way, used to always point out that although there are those who drink 5 cups of wine, but we drink 4 cups of wine at Leil Pesach, and we leave out vehevesi, the 5th cup, which is all about Eretz Yisrael. And he points out that Eretz Yisrael is certainly our destination. We leave Mitzrayim on the way to Eretz Yisrael, but that's not our destiny. He differentiates between destiny and destination. Our destiny is the Torah. And Eretz Yisrael is meant to be the place and the ambiance in which we can be shomer the Torah and learn the Torah. So David HaMelech says, "V'yitein lahem artzas goyim." We will inherit the land of Israel. Bavur yishmeru chukah v'torosa. Clear. The purpose is to be shomer the Torah and chukah. Now, here I would add a footnote. Is it possible that some place in Chutz La'aretz, a place, I don't mean a specific place, I'm talking about a concept, an abstract concept, could have the status of Eretz Yisrael? Could I be physically located in Chutz La'aretz, but that location, call it X on the map, is Eretz Yisrael? But for this, you have to have more of a, what we call a Hasidic cup. If you're a Litvak, I don't have an answer for you. I don't believe anywhere on the face of the earth could be Eretz Yisrael. But if you're a Hasidic thinker, I mean, you think in terms of metaphors and secrets of the Torah that go beyond the Pshat, deep, 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 and you could have a Bechina of Eretz Yisrael even in Chutz La'aretz, whether it's a Beis Medrash, whether it's a Beis HaKnesses, perhaps even a Makom Kvura. Or a place where you yourself experience the miracle. And the Radak says, "Nosan lehem es haaretz al tnai sheyishmeru chukah v'torosa." It's a tnai. So again, I'm not saying that your average so-called Chiloni, I don't know what that means exactly, but non-religious Jew here in Israel would appreciate if I told him that the entire Zionist entity of receiving the land is all contingent on Shmiras Chukah v'Torosa. I don't know if he's ready for that. So it could be that the entire Zionist enterprise, in its roots and in its development even today, is to be treated in a whole different way. And we're going to divide up Klal Yisrael into segments, and each segment of Klal Yisrael is going to make its contribution. So that it could be that within the context of what these, again, I don't want to call them Chilonim are saying, they have a certain job, a certain responsibility, and that's their contribution. And we have to respect that. But the Al-Tanai, Sheyishmu Torosov, that's already addressing all of Klal Yisrael as an entity. And of course, Klal Yisrael includes those who should know what Shmiras, Chukov, Umishpatov, Vitorosov is all about. Now, this is based on the Radak and the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. I'm not 100% sure that Rav Soloveitchik is exactly on the same line and thinks the same way. And the reason I have my doubts is because Rav Soloveitchik used to identify specific isurim and mitzvos that are absolute prerequisites for Eretz Yisrael, but he would single them out. For example, in Parshas Achrimos, we have the Parsha of Arayos. And the Pasuk says, "V'lo saki ha'eretz eschem." And Rav Soloveitchik used to say, what does it mean that the land will vomit you forth? There's something about the atmosphere of Eretz Yisrael that is intolerant of certain kinds of toivos, of tumah. And in that parsha of Tumas Arayos, what's being told us is that the land of Israel has a certain kind of atmosphere. It's a spiritually infused atmosphere that doesn't tolerate certain types of evil, which are tumah, and will spit forth the sinners from the land. But from the fact that Rav Soloveitchik used to always emphasize X, Y, and Z, meaning these specific mitzvos, or this kind of a tumah, I get the impression that he was not of that ilk, that everything is a total package, that you have to either do all or nothing. And if you don't do it all, forget about Eretz Yisrael. You don't have a drisas regel in Eretz Yisrael because you haven't fulfilled all the mitzvahs. But rather, there's certain specific mitzvahs, and more likely isurim, that are absolutely necessary to uphold, and you have to adhere to these laws, otherwise we lose Eretz Yisrael. And it's really fascinating when you think about the fact that the state of Israel as an entity emerged primarily, if not 99%, from the secular Jews. Again, even though I hate that categorization, is that not the greatest paradox? It was saying in the name of the Radak that Nasan Lahem es ha'aretz al t'nai sheyishbu tarosa v'chugosa. And now we're saying that the kibbutznikim and the those chalutzim that established the state of Israel were weit from Yiddishkeit. Obviously, we have to find the Nekudas Tovos, in those who are so far from Yiddishkeit, and they have the Nekudas Tovos, a tremendous love and willingness to sacrifice themselves for the sake of Eretz Yisrael. Now he has a maral with another element in the equation. We have a principle called Kol Yisrael Chaverim Zelazeh, which means mutual responsibility. Says the maral, that concept of mutual responsibility has a very definite, specific relation to Eretz Yisrael. In the land of Israel, we become one nation, and we become mutually responsible for one another. And he has a marsha, which you'll see here on footnote number 42 at the end of this page, who speaks about nistaros. Nistaros means I can't be held responsible for what my fellow Jew violates in nistaros. It's behester. Says the marsha, unbelievable chiddush. But medvar mamurim, that's ad shelo avru es hayarden v'nichnasu la'aretz. But after avru es hayarden v'nichnasu la'aretz, we are responsible even for nistaros. It's a scary idea. Because after entering the land of Israel, we are all one entity, one unit. And now we become mutually responsible. And then we will find a punishment on someone for the iniquities of someone else. Before we entered into the land, Lo nasu mechubarim, there was no chibur. We were not one nation. We were just spread out throughout the four corners of the earth. But then we entered into the land, and there we emerge with a whole new category of arvus, of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazim. And that mutual responsibility, which reflects a unity of Klal Yisrael, is particularly related to Eretz Yisrael. And the Chassam Sofer has a beautiful metaphor. Of course, to appreciate it, we'd have to know a little bit more about Taras. But the sugi is actually in the Bavli in Chagiga. You can have chatichos in a kli, and there's a tziruf of all the chatichos together, even without negia. Even they don't touch one another, because they're in one kli. So, for example, you have two pieces of meat sitting in a kli, separated one from the other, so there's no maga. And the halacha is that kli shohebo harbe chatichos ochle v'noga tomi v'achas mehen bein shenoga b'chatichos zu bazu bein lo noga b'chatichos zu bazu nitmu kulam. They all become tameh. Why? He's talking about a case of lo nagu achatichos zu bazu. So if one chaticha is tmeya, how does it impart tumah onto the other chaticha? Why does the second chaticha get contaminated through tumas zav or whatever tumah might be? I mean, Bishleim in this kli was, was touched by a tumah. But as far as the chatichos inside the kli, there was never mago with those chatichos. So on a halachic level, what it means is tzirif kli. But on a philosophical level, hashkafically, it means a lot more than that. It means that we become one nation, dependent each on each other and responsible each for the other, because we're all in one kli. And what is that kli? Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael itself is the kli. Therefore, at the bottom of page 241, in the text itself, he writes, Eretz Yisrael, Eretz HaKodesh, Harei I Kekli Kodesh, Uvetzarefes es Klal Yisrael Lios Echad. V'im nitma Echad Ba'avera, Harei Kula V'Arvis. Aval Kodem Shabo Eretz Kedosha Lo Tzirfu Kli. There was no Tzirf Kli. Now we're on page 242. What happens when, after Golus, we go into exile, we're out of the land, and we said that the only Kli that's mitzaref us is a Kli Kodesh, like Eretz Yisrael. Now we're in Chutz La'aretz. Is there no din of Arvus? I mean, we know that Kol Yisrael HaReim applies. Let's say, for example, I could be yot to you in a mitzvah, in a bracha. Obviously, that applies to Chutz La'aretz as well as Eretz Yisrael. Says the Chassam Sofer and Achinami, there's no Arvus in Chutz La'aretz. Mikol makom yikashlu ish ba'avon achiv, ki bis arvam bein hagoyim yildu maseyem v'yimshechu hatovim achar haroim, and therefore yonshu kula. So we're not talking about Arvus. That can't be, because there's no Arvus in Chutz La'aretz. We borrow the term Kol Yisrael HaReim Zeh, but at the end of the day, there is no Arvus. So you ask me, why is one person punished for another? Because in a certain sense, he caused the other person to be nichshal. That's the Chassam Sofer. You have the Nezer, he says that there is Arvus and Chutz La'aretz. And again, we're going to go back to the tshuva of the Rogatchover, based on the Gemara in Ksuvis Daf Ayin Hey. And that is that even if we're in Chutz La'aretz, we're really still in Eretz Yisrael. In what sense? In sense that we identify with Eretz Yisrael. So that even if I'm in Chutz La'aretz, and surely I was born in Chutz La'aretz, nevertheless I'm considered as if I'm in Eretz Yisrael. And that generates a chiyuv Arvus.
And that should go back to pre-Matan Torah also. Like we had the Taina on Moshe Rabbeinu.
In terms of not identifying with the land, you mean?
In other words, the Klal Yisrael really had, or Bnei Yaakov really had the identification with Eretz Yisrael, Ivri Anochi, way back before Matan Torah. So you should really have, even Arvus should go all the way back there.
And maybe that's why Yosef L'shitaso was, again, I don't want to use this word in a pejorative sense, but he was, maybe Diba Ra El Yaakov. That was because he felt Arvus. And on the flip side, the brothers felt a certain mutual responsibility, and they felt that Yosef was undermining that Arvus. He was really creating dissension.
Roberta, you say that the Chassam Sofer's Chiddush, like very casually, like to me, this is like an earth-shattering Chiddush to say there's no Arvus in Chutz La'aretz.
Right.
It's like, wow.
He says, Afal Pisha ein Arvus, Mikol makom yikashlu ish bi'avon achiv.
Yeah, but that's a different level for us than Arvus.
A whole different level. Yeah. I don't know if he means it al pi halacha. I think he means it al pi drush.
Uh,
And would you say maybe it's not Arvis on the highest level? Remember, we said Eretz Yisrael and Torah are connected, so that's an Arvis of the highest level. Arvis with regards to Torah would be one on a level just on that part, maybe.
So how does chutzatz fit into that? I didn't catch.
Just Arvis. We're discussing this Arvis, right? We're saying the Arvis is Eretz Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael going into Eretz Yisrael, but we said before that Eretz Yisrael and Torah are connected. So the Arvis, which is for Eretz Yisrael, there's an Arvis for Torah as well, right? So there is an Arvis which Bnei Yisrael has because they're connected to the Torah. Would you not say that? You know, the Arvis is Eretz Yisrael, but the Arvis is also, but the Torah and Eretz Yisrael are connected. So there's an Arvis maybe that's connected to Torah.
Even outside of Eretz.
Right.
And that might be a low-level arvus, which is a mutual responsibility because we live together. And if I don't separate myself from the goyim and behave in a Jewish way, in a uniquely Jewish ethical way, and I'm going to have an impact on other Jews who will follow my example because we're all looking, at each other and trying to sift out and sort out exactly how we should behave, especially living in Golos, in Chutz La'aretz. So he only touches on the tip of the iceberg here. I have a feeling that there's a lot more research that has to be done in order to learn the sugya properly and appreciate what the Chassam Sofer may be saying or what he's not saying. This idea of tzir of kli, and the kli has to be a kli kodesh, and then the tumah travels throughout the entire kli, even without maga, and then to say that Eretz Yisrael is a kli kodesh, and now we become all interdependent and intertwined in Eretz Yisrael by virtue of the kli, because the Eretz Yisrael is the kli kodesh. I mean, how that impacts on Kol Yisrael HaReivim Zebazeh has to really be taken under consideration. But the bottom line is, just in hashkafa terms, that we have a greater and more intense responsibility, mutual responsibility in Eretz Yisrael than we do in Chutz La'aretz.
It's a beautiful idea, the Kli, Machzik, creating that Arvis. Certainly.
So we're interconnected because we are connected through the Kli. We're all the same Kli. This is a kind of drasha that if you wouldn't have told me it was some sofer, I would have told you it's the Beis HaLevi. It's so typical of the Beis HaLevi, if you know what I mean. And it's drush on the highest level because you're taking a halacha and you're darshaning by analogy some sort of hashkafic philosophical idea. And it's striking in its similarity to the original, to the halachic original. He mentions here on page 241 the Ketores. So the Torah says, Kaf achas asora zov malei Ketores. It's something that we repeat over and over again in the parsha of the Nesiim at the end of Nosah. So he asks, what's the extra word achas? It says kaf. Kaf is loshen yochid. It's got to be achas. It can't be kaf shtayim. L'lamdecha shakosiv osa kol mashe b'kaf achas. So this halach in Ketores, that anything that's in the kaf is mitzuraf yachad ki guf echad, lefisha kli mitzaref es kol haprudos shal haktoros lios echad lekodesh. He doesn't go into detail. Again, I don't know if you're if you're able to open up the Gemara, Chagiga Chav Gimel Amid Beis, to see exactly what does it mean that all the Torahs in the Kaf is Guf Echad. I don't know what the implication is, maybe in terms of shear of Torahs and how much has to be burnt, in the Kaf Machta. I don't know. So you'll take a look in Chagiga Chav Gimel Amid Beis. But again, that idea of Kaf Achas, the Achas which unifies us in the Kaf. Now, I wanted to say something here, and you'll either reject it and tell me to go fly a kite, or maybe you'll like it. I don't know. When you're talking about Siruf in Ktores, in one Kaf, making it into Guf Echad, I automatically remind myself of the declaration on Leil Yom Kippurim, on Leil Kol Nidre, when we say, Ono Matir L'S'alim Havaryanim, because the Gemara says in Krisus that in the Torah we have Chelbana, which is Reicho Ra. So the uplifting of even the Chelbana Jew is a result of this concept that we're all Guf Echad. So if the Torah is made up of different segments, one of which is Chelbana, but it's all Guf Echad because the Kaf. So there's a tziruf in which the Chelbana is no less important than the rest of the 12 Samamonim. And we're left with a Jew who represents the lowest echelon of commitment to Torah mitzvahs. And maybe this is the answer to the question that we raised earlier, that by connecting Eretz Yisrael and Torah, you ask yourself the question, how is it that the paradox that Eretz Yisrael in our modern times was established as a state, as a nation by Chalutzim, who were not, particularly observant, to say the least. But maybe those Jews are uplifted by Eretz Yisrael because Eretz Yisrael is the Kaf, Eretz Yisrael is the Kli Kodesh that links together all the Jews. So even those Jews who might be classified as Chalutzim, as Chelbana Jews, I hate to say it. And you know that in Breslov Hasidus, everything is about finding the good. You know what I'm talking about? And that's really what Rav Kook was all about. He wanted to find the good. And he realized that Hashkoch had placed these so-called chalutzim, with the shorts and the hoe and rake in that position that is still having an impact on Jewish history today, whether you observe Yom Ha'atzmaut or you don't. That's irrelevant right now, because what's relevant is that the state of Israel today plays a major role in Jewish history. I don't think anyone can deny that. You'd be an ostrich in the sand if you denied that.
We do have some of those.
Okay. Well, I'd rather find, I want to find the good spots, and to elevate those good spots and realize how much we owe them and how much we recognize them and how much we respect them. And they may be misguided in terms of Torah because in most cases, they didn't even have that education. As Rav Kook used to always quote this halacha in the Rambam of Tinok Shenishma. And I don't remember where the pasuk is, but the pasuk compares Eretz Yisrael to our Ravos, Arvei Nachal, which are one of the four minim. The Gemara tells us that min, which is called Arvei Nachal, is Ein Botam Ve'Ein Boreach. Represents the real lower echelon. And Eretz Yisrael is somehow uplifting even the Aravos Jew. I have to find that pasuk for you. Now he speaks about Yoshua as a Talmud of Moshe Rabbeinu. This is on the bottom of page 242. First of all, Moshe Rabbeinu passes on the baton to Yoshua. Yoshua is going to conquer Eretz Yisrael and sanctify it. So here we have a connection between the Rav and the Talmud. And once again, it's that connection between Torah and Eretz Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu representing the Nosei Torah, and Yoshua representing the Nochel Es Haaretz. And here he quotes the Gemara Babasa, famous Gemara, Pnei Moshe Pnei Chama, Pnei Yoshua Pnei Levada. So that Yoshua, who conquers the land of Israel, is compared to the moon. The moon has no independent source of light, but rather reflects the light from the sun. And the moon has to turn, so to speak, towards the sun in order to receive that light. And Yoshua has to turn towards his Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu, to receive the Torah. HaTalmid tzarich lechaven es libo keneged harav. And Eretz Yisrael, which was given to us by the Talmud, also tzrichel yos mechuvenes klapi harav, klapi HaTalmud, Talmud klapi harav, which means Moshe Rabbeinu and his Torah. And finally, on page 243, he says that we are now in a time period of kibbutz golios. And the nevuah of Yeshaya Ubo of Bim Eretz Ashur V'Aridoch Eretz Mitzrayim is now coming to fruition. Say ure'eh shelo kol agolios shavim. Those who come on Aliyah from the Golus, they fit into a myriad of categories. Yesh haboim la'aretz mifnei lo chatzeihem. Now, one of the great achievements of the establishment of the state is that Jews who cannot find freedom and live without harassment have a homeland in Eretz Yisrael. Yesh haboim mipnei ritzono. You have another category of Jews who have a tremendous desire to live in the land. They feel that's part of their dveikus, they're part of his karvus and his chazkus to get closer to Hashem. And if you read Yeshayahu properly, he tells you it's in Perek Samach. He says, Mi ela ka'av, av means a cloud, tofena, ukionim el aruboseya. And I think we've discussed this in the past. Please tell me if I'm right. Or it's deja vu, I don't know. We have two shalom here, two metaphors. We have the metaphor of the cloud that is sort of floating through the air, and we have the Yonah, the dove, which is flying through the air. So Rav Kook says the following. Both of them are sort of flopping, whether it's the clouds that are moving along, whether it's the Yonah that's flying. But the fundamental difference is that the clouds move without any self-locution. There's no movement in an intellectual sense. There's no mind in the cloud. But the Yonah makes a decision to fly. Hayonah afa bashamayim miratzon atzma. Lo chen ha'av, av with an ayin, of course, shehu eno af miritzono, elakoch acher me'ifo. Bi'av u'biyonah mucholim shnei sugei shavim li'eretz Yisrael. Ha'av is the cloud that's forced to move, and a person has to move and live in Eretz Yisrael. The Yonah, on the other hand, is representative of the individual, has a true, genuine inner will and longing for Eretz Yisrael. He gravitationally pulls to Eretz Yisrael because he wants Eretz Yisrael. Ki ratzu avodeches avanehem, as we said before. And he, like the Yonah, goes back to his home. He feels like Eretz Yisrael is his home, and he has to return home. So we have this beautiful mashal interpreting the Nevuah of Yeshayahu Navi, comparing Klal Yisrael either to the Av or to the Yonah. Now, do you have page 244? I don't know. David, are you able to, not now, I don't mean now, but for next week? Are you there, David? I don't know. If I don't see you, I don't know if it's just, I guess you're not there. Anyway, theoretically, if you are there, there's an essay here, which I'd love to learn, starting on page 244, ending on page 258. And this is, again, giving us a little bit of an insight into Eretz Yisrael, its sanctity, its chavivus. So if somebody doesn't mind, I'll try to send a message also to David, but if you see David, tell him to start on page 244 and finish the chapter. Okay then?
Okay, thank you, Rav. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, I get a little emotional about these topics. I can't help it. It's part of my bloodstream.
We're with you.
It all started, by the way, just I don't want to keep you here, but the 6-Day War. I mean, that's what really changed my life. It changed my father's life. I mean, my father, since the 6-Day War, there wasn't a drasha that he didn't give in the shul about Eretz Yisrael. That was it. And my father, to a large extent, felt that being in Chutz La'aretz, he was a shliach, trying to uplift the people and connect them to the land of Israel. He had tremendous insights into what was going on in Eretz Yisrael, even though he was so far away. And I'll never forget, my father was a card-carrying member of the Mizrahi movement. And when there was a vote in the Knesset, and because of political reasons, the Mafdal, if you remember the old saying, Mafdal, all of a show. Anyway, the Mafdal had to vote together with the secular Zionists, but there was one Mafdal member who refused to vote with him because Torah comes first. And my father sent him in those days they had, what do you call it?
Telegram.
A telegram, right?
Zoom.
Who ever heard of a telegram? I have the telegram in which he congratulates him as a man of principle. And my father was then the president of the Rabbinical Council of America. It was a pretty important position at that time in Jewish life. I think it still is probably, but all right then. So I wish you all a great week. And
Rabbi Mirsky's background is what? This Yitzchak Mirsky, like what's his?
He's a great lover of Eretz Yisrael. He's a little bit more part of the, here's David. David,
asking to copy 244 on.
David, if you could do me a favor for next week, if you could start on page 244 till the end of the chapter, that'd be a great tova. And the chapter ends on 258.
Okay.
All right, you got it?
Yeah.
Okay. He's a man that, he's in both worlds. He's very much, part of the, I don't know if you know Harnof, he's very much a Harnofer in that sense. And, but he has Shroshim. You have to keep in mind, a lot of people miss this. And I think it's probably true for Polish and for Hungarian, but I'm going to talk about the Litvakis. The Lithuanian Jews were completely decimated by Hitler. I mean, so were the Polish Jews. I mean, who wasn't decimated? And those few survivors from Lita had a whole different hashkafa towards the state of Israel, because they saw it with their own eyes, what you and I, Baruch Hashem, will never see. Hopefully he'll never see. And they knew what the significance was of the state of Israel. And with all its deficits and drawbacks, and there are so many I don't even want to talk about, but nevertheless, this is what we needed desperately. And some of these Lithuanian Jews got involved in these, in sending arms, guns to the, whatever it was, Jabotinsky and his guys, and the various different groups, the underground groups and so forth. But
it didn't get translated to Lutvaks, like those real Lutvaks, didn't get translated to the next generation.
No, it did not. It did not. And by the way, that's a phenomenon. Again, if it's not the state of Israel, it's a phenomenon in the Hasidic world in terms of getting a job and making a living. I can tell you about my cousins in Bells, and now they became Bavavas, because in Borough Park there's no Bells really, there's just Bavav. But it's the same phenomenon. It didn't get passed down to the next generation. And in the Friedrich Dar, the previous generation, you knew that there's such a thing as getting a job.
Nobody would have said in that generation after 48 and so on, anything bad. I'm not talking about Satmar or Turakarta, but Eretz Yisrael was. But somehow the next generation, it's a tragedy. The yeshiva world doesn't have any relationship.
I think, Bobby, there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. I think things are going around very slowly. It's not something that's nikar la'ayin, but there is something going on.
Okay.
Whether it's because of financial considerations and pressures, whether it's because, again, now we're in a funny trend now because of the new government, but
I mean, the recognition of the Nisim v'Niflois that happened and are continuing to happen in Israel, the entire, if you want to call it Litvish Yeshiva world, not excluding the Rav, and his, descendant and his Talmud and all that, but the Litvaks, like the Yeshiva world, it's like they don't even think about it. It's amazing. I mean, I'm reacting to this drush of Rav Mirsky to say, how can anybody not, have a sense of wonder at all these things that happen, and they're all part of it in physical. They're living there and all that stuff. In many of them, not talking about the guys in the U.S., but anyway, to me, it's a major tragedy.
But I do see a little bit
I'm
of.
glad to hear that.
Again, it's not nikar la'ayin, but there is a certain trend. I mean, lahavdil elf havdolos. I don't mean to equate this, but the attitude towards Rav Shlomo Kalbach, for example, nothing to do with Zionism. Now, I'm not talking about that. You will begin to see, again, it's not nikar la'ayin, that even in Litvish circles, they're beginning to reevaluate.
That's amazing. That to me, amazing. It's amazing.
Amazing.
40 years ago, in the yeshivas I went to, you weren't allowed to sing Karlbach.
Correct. I taught in Landed College. The trend of L'cha Dodi with Karlbach, the Rosh Hashiva objected. We're not going to have it. And things are changing now.
Right.
Things are changing, again, very slowly. These revolutions don't happen overnight.
Right.
Even the attitude towards Rav Soloveitchik is slowly changing. It's not where it should be, but, maybe, he's also a Talmud Chacham. Maybe he has something to teach us. That's what I'd like to believe. I mean, maybe I have vested interest here in all these issues, but I do think that there's a certain
optimist,
a certain maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but a certain openness that I'm seeing here in Eretz Yisrael in certain circles. Again, it's very limited and it's not radical. It's not something that it's on the surface, but it's below the surface,
If you have one more second, if you ask the question the other way also, do you see that in the secular world, the Chiloni world, that there's a little bit of spirituality that's pulling people in,
well, look,
also
Bobby,
on the other side.
At the what's the word I'm looking for? At the fear, at the risk. That's the word I'm looking for. At the risk of sounding like I'm commissioned to say this, which I'm not. You have to trust me on this. We go back a while, and there's an organization here. I think I may once upon a time, maybe I mentioned, I don't know. It's called Ayelet HaShachar. Are you familiar with it? If you can, go online. The fellow's name is Shlomo Ranan. The man lives in an ideal world. He's like up in the clouds, but very much with it. It's like strange. He's a man with vision, self-sacrifice, the real McCoy ideal from the yeshiva belt. And he created an organization called Ayelet HaShachar. My connection is because he recently called on me. I just finished a series of 4 lectures. You can get it online if you want to hear them, in a place called Modi'in. Now, Modi'in is one of the, like the upcoming Tel Avivs in Israel. It's not overly Haredi. I mean, that's an understatement. And he asked me to give a series of lectures in English for the Anglo-Saxon crowd. And if you read about him, the man is entering into kibbutzim that never knew what a shul was, that never knew what a Sefer Torah was, garnished. Whatever Yiddishkeit they thought of in their mind was all negative. And he's putting up mezuzahs, and he's trying, again, I don't know if he has the funds for it, but he's trying to pay people to observe Shemitah. And, in some secular circles, it's mind-boggling. They have, especially among Sfaradim, they have beliefs that are in scholars. I don't know what they believe, but you can convince them that if they'll be Shomer Shemitah, miracles are going to happen. And he has interviews. I've seen one after the other. He has me on a list, so I get sometimes his very short videos, and he interviews a secular kibbutznik, a man. I'm just giving one example in the 80s, who never knew what a shul was.
Right.
So again, I'm just showing you one little bright spot. I'm sure there are other Kiruv organizations, and especially among Sfaradim, but that's changing too, unfortunately. But now you have singers, entertainers who are introducing Jewish themes and words and psukim, and they're becoming very popular throughout the state of Israel.
That was one of the examples that somebody was talking to said that the music in Israel is spiritual music. Like the popular music, it uses psukim and talks a lot about God, and it sort of permeates the environment in a way that it's just interesting. And come back to Rav Kook, those early kibbutzniks who were lahashmid and were lahachis, whatever, they had, maybe they had they had a right or a reason, and they had a bitterness for certain, but their kids don't have that same sense, and they seem to be, like you said, this kibbutznik is he's willing to consider to think about spirituality and so on. So it's a very fascinating.
I'll just end with one very short sentence here. Remember the name Yossi Sarid?
That's the exact Ryan.
Well,
but his
kids, and not only that, I want to tell you about Yossi Sarid, who, again, I don't want to say bad things about him, but there's a lot to say about him. The man had like a gemach. I don't think he called it a gemach, and he would help couples, chasanim, financially, and he never differentiated between a Haredi or a secular Zionist. And the man helped a lot of couples. You know, it's like in Eretz Yisrael, we're in that Kli Kodesh, and we're all independent, interdependent, and whether we like it or not, we're all B'sir Echad, you know. In Chutz La'aretz, we have a similar phenomenon, but it goes in the other direction because we have to gather together and unite in order to represent ourselves to the non-Jews. All right. Anyway, everyone should have a great week. All right, call too.
Thank you. Call too.
Oh, yeah.